I examined the frame first. Swollen wood, little warped from seasonal shifts. Nothing complicated. I got down to work while she stood a few feet behind me, watching silently. The room didn't feel tense, but it didn't feel warm either. It was more like walking into a home that had forgotten what voices sounded like. As I unscrewed the hinge and reset the alignment, I could feel her eyes on me, not judging, just observing, maybe even hoping I'd say something first. But I didn't. Rush it. Some people need space to talk. Others need silence to realize they want to. When I tested the door, it swung smoothly. No resistance. It's working now, I said gently, stepping aside to let her try it. She reached for the knob, paused. For half a second, like the idea of something working on the first try was unfamiliar, and opened it. It didn't stick. She smiled faintly, more with her eyes than her lips. "Thank you," she said, and then, after a breath, added, "Wood. You stay for coffee?" "I just made some. If you have time." I knew I had another job after this. But something about her tone, the quiet desperation under her politeness, made me nod. I followed her into the kitchen, which was as spotless as the rest of the house. She poured 2 cups and set one in front of me. No sugar, no cream, just. Black Eye didn't mind. He sat there, the silence louder than any conversation. Then she spoke again, softer now. "I don't usually cry like that. Not in front of strangers. It's just, everything's been quiet for so long. My kids are grown, and my daughter's in Spain, my son's married and in Oregon. I don't hear from them much, and my mom passed last year, and after my divorce I didn't really try to meet people again. It all felt too hard, too late." I listened, letting her words settle. She looked down at her coffee, fingers wrapped tightly around the mug, like it was the only thing keeping her grounded. "This house used to be loud," she continued. "My kids ran through these halls, played music too loud, fought over the TV. There was always something, birthday decorations, pizza nights, chaos. But now it's just the hum of the fridge and the sound of my own thoughts." Her voice cracked a little on that last part, and she took a breath to steady herself. "I guess I let it all shrink. My world, my hope. I wake up some days and forget what day it is. And when you knocked, it was like I don't know, something just gave out. I didn't plan to cry, I just did." She looked up at me then, as if trying to gauge whether she had scared me off. She hadn't. Not even close. "You're not the first person I've worked for who's felt this way," I said gently. "But maybe you're the first to admit it out loud." That earned a soft, grateful laugh from her. She looked surprised by it, like she hadn't heard herself laugh in a while. "Well," she said after a moment, "maybe you'd be open to coming by again? Not just for repairs. I've always got something around the house that needs fixing. Little things. And I make a pretty good pot of coffee." I smiled, the kind of smile that comes from a quiet understanding. I said, "I think I can make time." As I stood and gathered my tools, she walked me to the door. Her expression was lighter now, still weary, but touched with the first trace of connection. I stepped back onto the porch as the clouds shifted, letting a bit of pale sunlight break through. Driving away, I realized this wasn't just another call. This wasn't just about a door. She didn't need a handyman as much as she needed a witness to her life, a reminder that she was still seen. And maybe, just maybe, I needed that too. I hadn't meant to think about her again so soon. But the next morning, there she was, in my mind, her voice, her tired smile. The way she clutched that coffee mug like it anchored her. Most clients fade into the background once I leave their homes. Jobs blur together, names get forgotten. But she stayed. I kept hearing her words, and more than that, the silence between them. That kind of quiet doesn't come from having nothing to say, comes from having said it all to people who never listened, or maybe never stayed. I drove around town that morning with a list of small repairs on my dashboard and her name in my head. Not even her full name, just the softness of how she said it when I asked before I left yesterday. Marianne, it suited her. There was an elegance to it, a calm weight like something from an older song. Remember thinking, if her name were a room, it would be one with soft light and quiet music playing faintly in the background. It wasn't like me to get poetic about a job, but something about her invited reflection. Because she was so good at hiding the chaos beneath the surface. Or maybe because she didn't try to hide it at all. The jobs went by fast tightening a stair rail, placing a leaky hose, adjusting a cabinet door. My hands moved on autopilot, but my thoughts circled back to her front porch. That last look she gave me before I left lingered longer than it should have. I told myself I was just being decent, just being kind. But by the time I stopped for lunch, I found myself driving past her street without even planning to. I didn't stop, just slowed enough to look at the quiet outline of her house. Same tidy yard, same closed curtains. I imagined her sitting inside with that same mug of coffee, alone again. That night, I couldn't sleep right. Maybe it was the weather. Or maybe it was the way the world gets quieter at night and forces you to hear the questions you'd rather avoid. I kept wondering, what did she do after I left? Did she cry again? Did she sit in that same chair and stare out the window? Did she feel worse for having opened up, or slightly better for not pretending? Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The next morning I called her. I had never done that before, not without a follow-up request, or invoice to deliver. I'd told myself I'd offer to check the garage door. I remembered it groaned when it opened, and maybe she hadn't noticed, or maybe I just needed an excuse. She answered after the third ring, her voice cautious but not cold. "Hi, it's the handyman," I said, realizing I never gave her my name. I was just thinking about that garage door. It sounded off when I left. "I'm nearby today, if you want me to swing by." She was quiet for a moment. "Then you don't have to, but I'd like that. If it's not too much trouble." It wasn't, not even close. By the time I got there, she was already outside, standing by the side door in a light sweater, her hair loosely pulled back. She looked surprised to see me, like she half expected I wouldn't come. But then she smiled. Real this time, and it reached her eyes. She looked different. Still weary, but less fragile. Or maybe just less afraid of being seen as fragile. We walked into the garage together, and I set to work inspecting the door mechanism. It wasn't in terrible shape, just needed some lubrication and realignment. While I worked, she sat on an old stool, sipping from a new mug. This one had a tiny chip on the rim and said, "Best mom ever." She caught me looking at it and said, "My daughter gave me this years ago. She doesn't know I still use it." I nodded but didn't push. People volunteer things when they're ready. And sometimes, those tiny sentences hold more meaning than a whole hour of small talk. I finished the adjustment and had her test the door. It moved with a soft whir instead of the old groan. She beamed, then laughed lightly. "I really do fix things," she said. But the way she said it made me feel like she wasn't just talking about the door. She invited me in again, this time offering tea instead of coffee. I accepted, not because I needed it, but because I didn't want to leave yet. The kettle took a while to boil, and we filled the time with easy conversation. She told me she used to be a teacher, that her days were once filled with children's voices, lesson plans, chalkboards, and parent meetings. Retirement was supposed to feel peaceful, she said, but it just feels empty sometimes. Her independence was hard-earned, a point of pride. But even the strongest people need to feel connected. And maybe that's all she really wanted, someone to sit across from her and not be in a rush to leave. Someone who didn't ask her to shrink her pain into something polite. After we finished our tea, I stood to go. She followed me to the door again, but this time, her hand lingered near the knob, almost like she didn't want to open it just yet. She turned to me and said, "Thank you again. Not just for the door, for coming back." I gave her a small smile. Some doors are worth fixing more than once. Her laugh this time was lighter, almost musical. And as I stepped out into the afternoon sun, I realized I didn't feel like I'd just completed a job. I felt like I'd been trusted with something rare. On the drive home, didn't turn on the radio like I usually do. I just listened to the hum of the engine and let the quiet be enough. Because sometimes the silence isn't heavy. Sometimes it's the space where something new begins. I didn't expect her to call. Truthfully, I didn't expect anything at all. I told myself that going back to fix the garage door was just me doing a thorough job, and that staying for tea afterward was just politeness. About Marianne lingered with Minot in the way a person might stick in your memory because they're particularly beautiful or bold, but in the way a quiet room can leave you thinking longer than you meant to. She didn't fill the air with stories to impress. She didn't overshare, but the few things she did say felt heavy with a kind of longing I couldn't ignore. That night, back in my small apartment, I found myself glancing at my phone more than I cared to admit, half hoping a message or a missed call would appear. Of course it didn't. She didn't seem like the type to reach out. She was still cautious, probably too used to handling everything alone to know how to ask for company. The week passed with the usual noise jobs here and there. Cracked tiles, flickering lights, the kind of little household repairs that people always put off until they can't anymore. But through it all, my mind kept going back to her. I'd find myself staring too long at front porches that looked like hers, or pausing when I passed streets in the older part of town, wondering if her curtains were still drawn shut. On Thursday, after replacing a sink faucet for an older couple who barely noticed I was there, I sat in my truck and pulled up her number. I didn't press call. I just stared at it. I couldn't explain what I was hoping for, some excuse, maybe some reason to go back without overstepping. But I had nothing. The door worked. The kettle had boiled. I had no reason to show up again. And yet, that didn't stop me from driving past her street one more time. The universe must have had a strange sense of timing, because just as I turned the corner, I saw her out front, kneeling in the dirt near her flower beds. She wore a wide-brimmed hat and soft garden gloves, her hands covered in soil. For a moment, she looked completely at peace, till she stood up and winced, grabbing at her lower back. Oh, didn't even think. I pulled over, got out, and walked toward her before my conscience had time to argue. "Hey," I said gently, not wanting to startle her. She looked up surprised, then smiled in a way that told me she wasn't bothered by the unexpected visit. If anything, she looked relieved. "I guess I should have known I couldn't get away with gardening in silence," she said, brushing her gloves together. "Must look a mess." "You look like someone who could use a hand," I offered. She hesitated, eyes scanning my face, probably weighing whether to accept the help or keep holding on to that old independence like armor. Then she stepped aside and motioned to the flower bed. "These poor things are stubborn. I'm trying to replant them before the weather shifts again." I grabbed a small trowel from her gardening tote and knelt beside her, working quietly as she pointed out which roots to loosen, which ones were salvageable. The silence between us wasn't uncomfortable this time. It felt natural, filled with a mutual understanding that didn't require explanation. She moved slowly, clearly nursing that sore back. But she kept going, focused, patient, even graceful in the way she handled the earth. After a while, we sat on the edge of her porch steps, wiping our hands with old rags she brought out from the house. She offered lemonade this time, not tea, and we sat sipping quietly, watching the wind rustle the taller bushes along her fence. "You know," she said after a while, her voice quieter than before, "I used to hate silence. After my daughter moved out and the house got quiet, it felt like the walls were pressing in. I'd turn on the radio or the TV just to hear something." I glanced at her, sensing this wasn't just idle conversation. But lately, she continued, "It's not the silence that hurts. It's knowing no one's on the other side of it. You can talk to yourself all you want, but eventually it starts to feel like you're just fading." I didn't respond right away. What do you say to someone who confesses that kind of loneliness so plainly? I looked at her not the way a man looks at a woman, but the way one human looks at another who's been quietly carrying something heavy for too long. There was no need for pity in my gaze, just acknowledgement. "I get that," I finally said. "Different reasons maybe, but yeah, I've lived in a lot of apartments that stayed too quiet too long." She gave a small nod like she appreciated that I didn't try to fix her sadness, just shared it. The sun had dipped low enough too, cast long shadows across her lawn. I stood up, brushing dirt from my jeans. "Let me check the sprinkler system before I go. If those flowers are going to survive, they'll need more than just wishful thinking." She smiled and handed me the key to the outdoor panel without question. It felt like a small gesture, but I understood the weight of it. Trust, after all, isn't something she gave away easily. I stayed for another half hour, fixing a leaky connection in the valve and adjusting the timer. Nothing heroic, nothing overly dramatic. Just small tasks that added up to something useful. When I returned the key, she looked at me for a long moment before saying, "You don't have to keep showing up, you know?" "I know," I replied, then added, "But I want to." That evening, back in my apartment, I didn't feel restless like before. I felt grounded. And for the first time in a long while, I didn't end my day alone in my thoughts. I ended it thinking of her smile as she watched the water mist over her newly planted garden. The following weekend, I found myself double-checking the contents of my toolbox, even though I didn't need to bring anything. There was nothing left to fix, at least nothing she had mentioned, but I couldn't shake the pull that led me back to her neighborhood. Maybe it was the way she had looked at me when I told her I wanted to keep showing up, not with surprise, but with a softness that felt earned. I drove slower than usual, watching the familiar houses pass by. But it was her weathered porch and the half-cleared garden beds that made everything else blur into background. As I parked along the curb, I noticed her car in the driveway, and something about that small detail made me feel oddly relieved. I knocked, not too loudly, and waited. When she answered, her hair was tied up in a loose bun, and she wore a faded sweatshirt with sleeves pushed up to her elbows. There was no makeup, no forced expression, just Marianne, plain and unfiltered. And for some reason that made her more radiant than if she had dressed up for anything. She looked at me and smiled, and for a moment neither of us said a word. Then she stepped aside and let me in, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Her house smelled faintly of coffee and something warm, like cinnamon or vanilla. And the radio played low in the background, some old jazz song that made the place feel timeless. I followed her to the kitchen, where she had a loaf of banana bread, cooling on a rack, and 2 mugs already on the counter, one of which she handed to me without ceremony. We stood there for a moment, sipping in silence, until she asked if I had anything planned for the day. I shook my head, and she grinned in that way people do when they're glad, but trying not to show too much of it. She said she had found a few old boxes in the attic filled with things she wasn't sure what to do with, memories. She called them, as if the word carried equal parts weight and warning. I offered to help, and soon we were climbing the narrow stairs to the attic, the old wooden steps creaking beneath our feet. The attic was warmer than the rest of the house, sunlight filtering through a small round window at the far end, casting long, dusty beams across the floorboards. There were cobwebs in the corners, and a faint smell of old paper and fabric, but it didn't feel eerie, just forgotten. She pointed to a stack of boxes labeled in uneven handwriting, and I began carrying them down one by one while she followed. Behind, with a flashlight and an amused look on her face, we set everything in the living room and opened the first box. Inside were photo albums, some Polaroids, old greeting cards, a few newspaper clippings yellowed with age, and a bundle of letters tied together with a faded blue ribbon. She sat cross-legged on the floor and pulled out a photo of herself from when she was maybe 20, laughing with a group of women in what looked like a college dorm. She handed it to me without comment, and I studied the carefree grin she wore, a stark contrast to the reserved calm she carried now. She told me bits and pieces about her first job at a small publishing house, how she met her ex-husband during a poetry reading, how everything had seemed like it would last forever back then. There was no bitterness in her tone, just the quiet, a reflection of someone who had lived and lost enough to speak without needing to dramatize the pain. As she spoke, I listened not because I had to, but because I genuinely wanted to understand her. It felt like being trusted with pages from a book that had never been published. And each story she shared drew me closer to her real self. We moved on to the second box, which was filled with her daughter's childhood drawings. Old school reports, a few tiny shoes, and a worn-out stuffed bear with one eye missing. She held the bear for a long time, her fingers tracing the stitching, and then placed it gently in her lap like a fragile memory. She didn't cry, but her eyes looked far away for a moment, as if she were trying to touch a time she could no longer reach. I didn't speak, I just sat there with her, offering nothing more than my presence. And in that silence, I felt something pass between us that didn't need words. The third box was mostly booksome classics, a few journals, and one novel. With her name written inside the cover, she said she had tried writing once, years ago, but life got in the way. I asked why she stopped, and she shrugged, saying that sometimes, when no one's asking to hear your story, it feels easier to stop telling it. That stayed with me longer than anything else. After we'd gone through all the boxes, the sun had shifted in the sky, and golden light poured through her windows. She suggested we take a walk, so we stepped outside and wandered down her quiet street. She showed me the house 2 doors down where a woman named Sylvia used to hold piano recitals, and the oak tree that had once held a tire swing for the neighborhood kids. Everything she pointed out had a memory attached to it, and I realized this neighborhood wasn't just where she lived, it was where her life had unfolded, one chapter at a time. We ended up back on her porch, sitting on the swing while the day faded. She leaned her head back and sighed, saying it felt good to dust off the past, even if some of it was painful. I told her I was glad to be there for it, and she looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite name, some mixture of gratitude, curiosity, and maybe even the faintest glimmer of hope. When I stood to leave, she reached out and touched my wrist lightly, then let go, as if even that moment of contact was more than she was used to offering. I told her I'd see her again soon, and she nodded without speaking, her eyes following me all the way to the sidewalk. That night, back in my apartment, I didn't turn on the TV. I didn't need any noise to fill the space. All I needed was the quiet image of her on that porch, the way her eyes had softened when she spoke of things she'd hidden away for years, and I knew somehow that I wasn't just helping her reopen the past, I was becoming a part of whatever came next. The following Saturday came with overcast skies and a chill in the air, but I still found myself walking toward her house with the same anticipation I'd carried the week before. Something about Marianne had shifted in me. She wasn't just a woman I'd once found crying on her doorstep anymore. She was someone whose voice I recognized in my mind, someone whose laugh had found a home in the back of my memory. As I reached her gate, I saw her kneeling in the garden again, this time trying to wrangle a row of stubborn weeds that seemed to be mocking her efforts. She looked up when she heard my footsteps, her eyes lighting up with surprise and something warmer. I offered a half-joke about her becoming the neighborhood landscaper, and she laughed, wiping dirt onto her jeans. She stood, stretching her back, and asked if I came to help or just to make fun of her technique. I said both, and the smile that followed told me she didn't mind. We spent the next hour pulling weeds, replanting a few bulbs she had bought earlier that week, and chatting about small things, movies we liked, the best pizza places in town. Whether or not we'd survive a zombie apocalypse, it was easy, the kind of conversation that rolled without effort or agenda. And it surprised me how often our hands would accidentally brush, or how close we'd get when leaning over the same patch of soil. At one point, she paused and stared at a tiny purple flower sprouting stubbornly through a crack in the concrete path. She said she admired how it pushed through anyway, even though no one asked it to grow there. I didn't say anything then, but I knew she wasn't just talking about the flower. When we finished, she invited me in for a late lunch, something she called throw-together pasta that ended up tasting better than any fancy meal. We sat at her small kitchen table, elbows close, and somewhere between the second and third bite, she asked me if I ever got lonely. The question came so quietly that I almost missed it. I looked at her, and for the first time I saw that familiar fragility creep back into her expression, the kind that hovered just beneath the surface, masked by strength and independence. I told her the truth, that yes, sometimes I did. That even with people around, there were days when the silence in my apartment felt like it might swallow me whole. Her shoulders relaxed a little then, like hearing my answer gave her permission to admit the same. After lunch, she said she had something she wanted to show me. She disappeared into the back room and came out carrying a canvas about 3 feet wide, covered in swirls of blue and gray with streaks of gold cutting through the center like cracks of light. It was abstract, but emotional, something raw and turbulent, like a storm with a promise buried inside. She said she used to paint a lot, but hadn't shared any of it in years. She handed me the canvas without fanfare, asking what I saw. Told her it looked like hope punching its way through sadness, and her eyes filled so suddenly that I thought she might cry. But she didn't. Instead, she set the painting down, stepped close to me, and said thank you, not just for the comment, but for being here, for seeing her. The hours slipped by, and we found ourselves sitting on her front steps again, the sky dimming into early twilight. She asked if I believed people were meant to find each other, or if it was all just random timing. I said maybe both. That some people walk into your life like accidents but stay like purpose. She didn't reply, just tilted her head against the railing and let out a breath that sounded like she'd been holding it for years. I could feel the weight of the moment then, the quiet tension of two people teetering on the edge of something more, but not ready to name it yet. As I got up to leave, she walked me to the gate and hesitated there, one hand resting on the latch. She said she didn't want to keep needing someone, but also didn't want to keep pretending she didn't. I stepped closer, told her that needing someone wasn't weakness, it was being human. And maybe the strongest thing she could do was let herself be seen, fully, by someone who wouldn't run from it. She looked up at me, her eyes wide and unsure, and whispered that she was still learning how to do that. I said we could both keep learning. Then I turned and walked down the street, but not like I was leaving something behind. It felt more like I was heading toward something for the first time in a long time. A few days passed without a message from her, and though nothing had been promised between us, I found myself checking my phone more than usual, hoping for a ping, a simple hello, or even a photo of another rescued flower in her garden. But silence can be deceptive, doesn't always mean absence. And sometimes, the heart needs quiet before it knows what it wants to say. I let the stillness be what it was, not rushing it, not questioning it. And when her name finally lit up my screen, I smiled before even reading the message. She asked if I wanted to join her at the local flea market that Sunday. It wasn't a date, not explicitly, but it felt like more than a casual hangout. I said yes, without hesitation. The flea market was held in a sprawling old warehouse on the edge of town, its walls covered in fading murals and ivy creeping up the corners. Inside, the air smelled of old books, fresh popcorn, and incense. Rows of tables stretched in every direction, vintage clothes, handmade jewelry, dusty record players, oil paintings and trinkets no one really needed but everyone wanted to touch. Marianne walked ahead of me at times, pausing to inspect small things with that thoughtful gaze of hers, and other times she'd double back to show me something odd or beautiful or strange. She had a way of finding stories in everything. An old brooch reminded her of her grandmother. A cracked porcelain teacup sparked a memory of a tea set she once saved up for as a child. I didn't interrupt these recollections. I soaked them. And like chapters in a book, she didn't realize she was letting me read at one stall. She found a small music box shaped like a carousel. The paint was chipped, the metal key slightly rusted. But when she wound it and the tiny horses began to spin while a delicate tune played, her eyes lit up. She said her daughter used to fall asleep to that exact song, and for a second, her voice caught. She didn't dwell on the moment, she simply placed the box back on the table and moved on. But I lingered, paid for it quietly, and tucked it into my jacket pocket. I didn't know when I'd give it to her, but I knew I would. We ate lunch at a food truck parked by the entrance, sitting on the curb with burritos wrapped in foil and sodas sweating in the heat. She talked about wanting to travel again, about a road trip she once took up the coast, and how sometimes she missed driving aimlessly with the windows down and the music loud enough to drown out everything else. I asked her if she ever would. Again, and she gave a small shrug, the kind that hides a yes inside a maybe. I told her if she ever needed a co-pilot, I was decent at reading maps and terrible at singing, but full of enthusiasm. She laughed and tossed a napkin at me, calling me an optimist. I didn't correct her. As the day wound down, we wandered back through the last rows of stalls. She found a book of poetry by someone she used to admire and bought it without hesitation. As we walked back to the car, she flipped through the pages, reading lines out loud, like she was testing how they tasted. I watched her mouth form the words, her voice soft and slow, and something about it made me want to memorize the way she existed in that exact moment. Not everyone reads poetry like they mean it. She did. I drove her home as the sun dipped low, casting everything in amber. She leaned her head against the passenger window and closed her eyes for a bit, trusting me with both the road and the silence. When we reached her house, she invited me in for tea and I followed, already feeling like her living room had become a familiar place, like a second address I hadn't known I needed. As she busied herself in the kitchen, I pulled the carousel music box from my pocket and placed it on the side table where she kept her other odd little treasures. She noticed it almost immediately, eyes widening slightly, then softening as she recognized the gift. She didn't say anything right away, just touched it gently, then looked at me with a kind of affection that didn't require thank yous. We drank tea on the couch, our legs stretched out, a comfortable distance between us that no longer felt like a boundary. She asked me if I believed people could start over at any age, or if reinvention was just a romantic idea for novels and self-help books. I told her I thought starting over didn't always mean burning things down. Sometimes it meant planting something new next to what's already grown wild. She nodded slowly, like the metaphor settled somewhere deep in her, and said she hoped she wasn't too late to grow something again. The hours slipped by until the house was dim, except for a few lamps and the light from the kitchen. She didn't ask me to leave, and I didn't stand. Instead, we sat in the hush of shared space, the kind of quiet that isn't empty but charged. She leaned her head against my shoulder, just lightly, like she was still testing how much weight I could hold, and I let her rest there as long as she wanted. Outside, wind rustled through the trees, and inside, time softened around us. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't a declaration. It was just presence. And in a world that moves too fast, that alone felt like intimacy. When I did finally stand to go, she walked me to the door and lingered there. I could feel something unspoken settle between us in awareness, an anticipation, but also a peace. She reached for my hand briefly, squeezed it once, and whispered that she was glad I showed up when I did. I told her I wasn't going anywhere, and she smiled not because she needed to believe me, but because she already did. The next few weeks passed with a rhythm that felt both new and deeply comforting. I found myself drawn to her house like it had a gravity of its own, and Marianne welcomed me each time with a quiet smile and something brewing in the kitchen. We never labeled what we were doing. There were no grand pronouncements or awkward confessions. There was just this mutual understanding, a quiet kind of closeness that didn't need to be spelled out. Some days, we painted her living room walls a soft blue, taking breaks only when our arms ached from the rollers. Other days, we sat on her porch and read in silence, the occasional page turn or shared look saying more than words could. I never asked if she was still lonely. I didn't need to. The air around her had shifted, her steps lighter, her laughter easier, her eyes no longer holding that same buried storm. One morning I stopped by with no real reason, just a container of coffee, from a place downtown she'd once mentioned missing. She answered the door in sweatpants and a loose sweater, her hair a little messy from sleep. She didn't apologize or try to fix herself in a rush. Instead, she smiled like I was expected, like I belonged in the morning light with her. We sat in her kitchen, sipping slowly, and she pulled out an old photo album from the drawer near the sink. She said she hadn't opened it in years but felt ready to see it again with me. Each page turned like a chapter, the photos worn and curled at the edges, faces and places now faded but still pulsing with memory. She showed me pictures of her daughter as a toddler, of herself with shorter hair and a more guarded smile.
There
Was a man in a few of the early photos, always at the edges, never with his arm around her. She didn't explain who he was, and I didn't press. Some stories unfold in time, not on demand. Later that afternoon, she invited me to the community art show at the local library. She had submitted one of her pieces anonymously, a newer painting that captured the ocean under a stormy sky, just a sliver of golden light pushing through the clouds. It was displayed near the back, modestly framed, unsigned, yet unmistakably hers. When she saw people gathered around it, tilting their heads and whispering appreciation, her hand slipped into mine without warning. She didn't look at me, didn't need to. I felt her pride in the squeeze of her fingers, in the quiet tremble of her breath. That night, she let me stay a little longer, let the silence between us become softer, warmer. She played an old jazz record on her living room turntable, and lit a candle that smelled like cinnamon and vanilla. We didn't dance, but our shoulders touched on the couch. She leaned her head on mine like she had the night at the flea market. There was a comfort in it, a knowing. The next day I stopped by again and found her working in the garage, which I'd never seen before. It was cluttered with half-finished projects and boxes of things too important to throw away but too emotional to unpack. She stood in the center of it all, hair pulled back, sleeves rolled up, covered in dust but glowing, with purpose. She said she wanted to turn the space into a studio, a place just for her. I offered to help, and she hesitated for just a second before nodding. We spent hours sorting through old canvases, childhood keepsakes, and dusty books. She uncovered a small wooden box filled with letters. She paused, stared at them for a long moment, then handed them to me. She said they were letters she wrote to herself over the years during the loneliest nights when there was no one else to talk to. I didn't read them, not then. She didn't ask me to, but I held them carefully, understanding they were pieces of her soul folded into paper. That evening, we stood in the newly cleared garage, the light from a single overhead bulb casting shadows on the walls. She looked around and said it was the first space in her life that felt like hers, completely and unapologetically. I told her it looked like the beginning of something beautiful. She smiled not because of the words, but because she believed them. I saw it in the way her shoulders relaxed, in the way her breath came slower, steadier. Before I left, she reached up and gently touched my cheek. No words, just touch. It felt like something old being rewritten. I went home that night and couldn't sleep. I lay in bed replaying the day, every moment vivid and full. I kept thinking about those letters in the box and how much pain must have been poured into them, but also hope. Because she kept writing them, kept reaching for something. Somehow, maybe, I had become part of what she was reaching for. That thought filled me with a kind of quiet joy I hadn't known I was missing. I wasn't sure what we were becoming, what name to give it, but I knew it was real, and I knew I wanted to protect it. The next morning I found a note taped to my door. It was her handwriting. Elegant, a little slanted. Meet me by the lake. Bring coffee. No explanation, no time. Just trust. I drove out immediately, the early morning sun just beginning to stretch across the water. She was there, sitting on a bench in a long cardigan and boots, her hair pulled into a braid over her shoulder. She stood when she saw me, took the coffee, with a grin, and pointed toward a trailhead nearby. We walked for a long time, the world quiet around us, except for birds and the crunch of gravel beneath our feet. At one point, she stopped and said she needed to tell me something. My stomach tightened, unsure of what was coming. She said she hadn't cried in weeks, that every day she woke up now, she didn't dread the silence. She welcomed it, filled it with purpose. She told me that even though she was still figuring things out, still healing in places she hadn't dared touch for years, she no longer felt completely alone. And then she said the thing that undid me: you didn't save me. I saved myself. But you showed up right when I needed someone to believe I could. I didn't respond right away. I didn't need to. I just stepped closer, wrapped my arms around her, and held her tightly, knowing full well that sometimes the most powerful thing we can do for someone isn't to fix them, but to simply be there while they fix themselves. The days began to stretch into a rhythm that didn't need explanation, just quiet understanding. Marianne and I had, without ever declaring it, started building a world within the world. One where we met each other halfway, not just in proximity, but in presence. There were no official dates or confessions, but there were early mornings on her porch with shared mugs of coffee and late evenings where we both didn't want to say goodbye, so we didn't. Sometimes we sat in her living room with a record playing. Sometimes she painted while I worked on small repairs around the house, and sometimes we just walked in silence. And there was something in that silence, fullness, a comfort, like we were both learning that healing didn't need to be loud to be real. One Saturday, she surprised me by suggesting a trip to the countryside market. She said it had been years since she'd gone, and something about the fresh air and the messy joy of local vendors made her feel lighter. We drove with the windows down, and she hummed along to the songs on the radio, her hands sometimes resting on the edge of the seat, like it wanted to find mine but wasn't quite ready yet. When we arrived, she moved through the stalls with a kind of cautious excitement, like someone relearning how to be happy without guilt. She picked up a jar of wildflower honey, tasted fresh cheese from a local vendor, and spent an embarrassing amount of time talking to the woman selling handmade soaps. I didn't mind. Watching her rediscover these little pieces of the world was its own reward. We sat beneath a tree with our haul a small basket of pears, some cheese, a loaf of crusty bread. She handed me a pear and asked if I ever imagined my life turning out this way. I thought about it before answering. I told her I hadn't imagined much at all. I'd spent so much of my life reacting to things, jobs, bills, family expectations, that I'd forgotten how to imagine in the first place. She nodded slowly, like she understood. Then she said, "Me too." It was just 2 words, but they carried a weight of decades. Decades of loneliness, of roles played and masks worn, of long nights and quiet breakfasts, and laughter saved only. For her paintings, I didn't say anything. I just reached into the basket and broke off a piece of bread, handed it to her with a quiet smile, and we ate together under that tree like the world had paused just for us. After that, the tempo of our connection began to change, subtly but unmistakably. Her touches became more frequent, her hand on my back when I reached for something, her shoulder brushing mine when we passed in the hallway, her fingers resting a little longer on mine when she handed me something. I noticed the way she looked at me when I wasn't looking, the softness in her eyes, like she was memorizing something she didn't want to forget. One evening, as the sun was setting, we sat in her backyard watching the sky bleed into gold and orange. She turned to me suddenly and said, "Do you think everyone deserves a second chance?" I didn't ask what she meant. I just answered, "Yes." She smiled, a kind of sad, grateful smile, and leaned her head on my shoulder. That night, something shifted. Not in a dramatic Wayno kiss, no passionate declarations, just an understanding. We didn't need to define this thing between us. We just needed to keep showing up for it, and so we did. Day after day, we showed up. I kept fixing the little things in her house, and she kept slowly fixing the things in her heart. We were both works in progress, and somehow, we were okay with that. One afternoon, she showed me a painting she'd been working on in secret. It was a portrait not of me exactly, but of someone like me. A man with kind eyes and calloused hands, standing in a doorway, sunlight framing him like a promise. She said it wasn't finished yet. "Neither was I replied. And she smiled, tucking a loose strand of hair behind her ear in that way she did. When she felt shy and proud at the same time, then came the invitation that caught me off guard. Her daughter was coming to visit. The daughter she had spoken of only in fragments, like a distant character in a novel she wasn't ready to reread. Marianne asked me if I'd stay for dinner that night. I could see in her eyes that this wasn't just a request for company. It was a request for presence, for strength, for someone to stand beside her as she reopened a part of her life that had long been closed. I said yes without hesitation, even though I could feel my chest tighten with nerves. That evening I brought flowers. Not because I thought her daughter needed impressing, but because I knew Marianne would appreciate them. The table was set simply but beautifully, candles flickering, soft music playing in the background. She wore a dress I hadn't seen before, navy blue with tiny white specks like stars, and her smile was nervous, her hands fidgeting. When her daughter arrived, there was a moment of awkward silence. She was in her late 20s, confident and a little guarded. Her eyes flicked between Marianne and me with curiosity and something like suspicion. But as the night unfolded, the tension eased. We ate slowly, the conversation circling around safe topics: books, food, travel. And then, like a sudden breeze, the walls began to come down. Marianne spoke openly, more openly than I'd ever seen her. She talked about her loneliness, her art, the fear of becoming invisible. And then she said, "But I'm not invisible. Anymore someone saw me? Now I'm learning to see myself again, too." Her daughter looked at me then, not with judgment, but with something closer to understanding. She nodded once, barely noticeable, and that was enough. After dinner, she hugged her mother tightly and whispered something I didn't hear. And then she hugged me too, quick but genuine. As she left, I saw a softness in her eyes I hadn't seen when she arrived. That night, Marianne and I sat on the couch in silence, our hands intertwined. There was no need for words. We had crossed another threshold together. We had faced the past and hadn't turned away. The clock ticked softly, the world outside still. I looked at her and realized that I had fallen for her not in the way people fall in stories, all at once and without warning, but slowly, fully, with eyes wide open. I didn't say it aloud. I didn't need to. It was there in the way I looked at her, and in the way she leaned into me like she knew. That night, she didn't ask me to leave. I didn't. I stayed, not because it felt right, but because it felt inevitable. The morning after, I stayed over for the first time. Everything felt different, not in a jarring, unsettling way, but in the quiet certainty of something shifting permanently, like a tide turning just enough to reshape the coastline. The sun filtered through the sheer curtains of her bedroom, casting golden patterns across the hardwood floor, and I woke not to an alarm or the jolt of responsibility, but to the soft rhythm of her breathing beside me. She was turned away, one hand curled loosely near her chin, the other resting on the pillow, like she had finally let go of whatever she'd been holding on to. I lay there for a long moment, just memorizing the stillness, the warmth, the impossibility of this gentle reality that had grown out of one knock on a door and a woman's trembling voice asking for help. I slipped out of bed quietly and made my way to the kitchen, making coffee like it was my 100th time doing it here. Every creak of the floor, every clink of the spoon in the mug, like a note in some shared song we hadn't known we'd been writing. When she joined me not long after, wrapped in a long robe and blinking against the morning light, there were no words, no need for explanation. She reached for her cup with a small, thankful smile, and we stood in silence by the counter, sipping, and letting the morning settle around us like a promise. That day was the first we spent without any projects or errands or obligations. We didn't work on the garage or repaint anything or sort through old photographs. We didn't need to, right? Instead, we simply existed. We sat in her backyard, her feet tucked under her as she read a book, while I leaned back on the grass, staring. Up at the slow dance of clouds, at some point, she rested her hand on my chest and asked if I'd ever thought about what home really meant. I told her I used to think it was a place or a town or the right apartment, but now I wasn't. So sure. She nodded like she knew what I meant and said, maybe it's not a place at all. Yeah, maybe it's a person, or the way a person makes you feel like you belong. That sentence didn't hit me all at once. It unraveled slowly throughout the rest of the day, wrapping itself around everything we did. Every glance, every shared smile, every moment of unhurried peace. Over the next week, life became a quiet loop of togetherness. We weren't hiding from the world, but we were no longer rushing to meet it either. I still had work-hard jobs here and there, and she still spent hours in her makeshift studio, painting with a ferocity I hadn't seen in her before. But we always came back to each other like magnets resetting their pull. She'd leave notes for me on the kitchen table, scribbled in looping cursive. Don't forget your lunch or you looked especially tired yesterday. Get some rest. Sometimes she'd draw little sketches beside them, a coffee mug, a sleepy cat, once even a cartoon version of me with exaggerated shoulders and a goofy smile. In return, I'd fix small things around the house without her asking. A loose cabinet door, a creaky stair, the kitchen faucet that had been dripping for months. We didn't call these things love. We didn't need to. They just were. One afternoon, we decided to drive out to the coast. She said she hadn't seen the ocean in years. And I couldn't believe it's someone who painted waves so vividly, who captured the exact color of storm-tossed salt water with such aching precision. In a blanket, and we spent the day watching the tide roll in and out, speaking only when necessary. She took off her shoes and let the cold water wash over her ankles, laughing like a girl, free and unself-conscious. I stood beside her, watching the wind catch her hair and tug it around her face, and I felt something inside me shift again. She turned to me at one point, cheeks pink from the chill, and said, I used to think I'd never feel this again. Not just the sea, but this being alive, this being seen. I didn't answer. I just wrapped the blanket around her shoulders and held her hand until the sun dipped below the horizon. It wasn't all perfect. There were moments when she'd pull away, suddenly quiet or distant. I could see it in her eyes when a memory caught her off guard, or when the world outside crept in with its reminders of what had been lost. Sometimes I'd find her staring at her reflection, touching her face like she was trying to reconcile the woman she saw with the one she used to be. Other times, she'd ask questions like, "What are you doing here with me?" Or "Don't you think this is strange?" Never had the perfect answer. All I could tell her was the truth that I didn't think love or connection had an age limit, and that her heart, bruised and beautiful as it was, had more life in it than most people I'd ever met. She never argued with me. She just nodded and let herself be held. One evening, we received an invitation to a gallery show. It was a small event, local artists mostly, but she had submitted one of her newer pieces, one she'd painted after. Our trip to the coast was bold and soft at the same time, a wild swirl of color that somehow made sense when you stood still and let your eyes adjust. At the show, people gathered around it, admiring, analyzing, guessing at meanings. She stood at the edge of the crowd, watching quietly, her hand brushing mine. When someone asked her about the inspiration, she didn't flinch. She said it's about finding light in unexpected places and knowing when to stop hiding from it. That night, as we walked back to the car under a velvet sky, I told her I'd never seen anyone so radiant. She rolled her eyes, but she blushed too. Later at home, she asked me what scared me most. I thought about it and said, waking up one day and realizing I let something real slip away because I was too afraid to name it. She looked at me for a long moment, then kissed my forehead. It wasn't romantic in the typical sense. It was grounding, like she was pressing a seal into the moment to say, "We're here, we're real, and it matters." As we settled into bed, wrapped in layers of quiet warmth, I found myself thinking of the first day I met Hertha, tears on her cheeks, a crack in her voice when she said she was completely alone. It felt like a lifetime ago. And in a way, it was because the woman beside me now, the one who painted with fire and let herself laugh at her own jokes and wore joy like a new sweater. She was still getting used too. She wasn't alone anymore. And neither was I. The days that followed became a rhythm so natural, it felt as though we'd always been living this way. A quiet, steady pulse of companionship stitched into the fabric of our lives. We didn't talk about what we were or what label fit this fragile, blooming thing between us, and maybe that was the magic of it. There was no need to box it in. She had begun painting every morning now, a ritual as much about release as it was about creation, and I noticed her brushstrokes had changed. They were more fluid, more forgiving, less afraid of space. It was as if some part of her had unlocked, no longer painting with the weight of proving something to herself, but simply expressing what she had long carried. I watched her often from the kitchen window, her figure bathed in soft light, moving with grace and intention, unaware that she had already become the most beautiful canvas in the room. She had a way of doing little things for me that felt like answers to questions I hadn't asked. A jacket hanging near the door if it was cold. My favorite mug always clean. A blanket folded just so on the couch. I returned the favor in quiet gestures. I'd fill her car with gas without saying anything. Fix the gate before she noticed it was sticking again. Leave her notes that simply said, "You're doing better than you think." Neither of us were trying to earn anything. It just felt natural to care for each other this way. And maybe, in the simplest form, that was love, not grand confessions or passionate declarations, but this gentle tending to one another's lives. But even in the peace we had created, life still had its ways of testing us. One morning, she received a letter in the mail that I saw her hesitate to open. Her fingers hovered over the flap, eyes scanning the return address with a flicker of something unreadable. I didn't press. I just sat nearby, letting her take whatever time she needed. When she finally opened it, her shoulders sank, and she read silently for a long time. I offered her coffee, but she shook her head, placing the letter face down on the table. It was from her sister, someone she hadn't spoken to in years. A tangled history of misunderstanding and distance that neither had found the words to mend. Apparently, the sister was visiting town next week, and she wanted to reconnect. I could see the storm forming behind her eyes, that familiar battle between hope and fear. She asked me if she should do it, if it was foolish to believe anything good could come from reopening that door. I didn't give her an answer. I simply said that sometimes healing isn't about the other person. Sometimes it's about proving to yourself that you deserve peace. She nodded slowly, not convinced, but no longer completely closed off. When the day of the visit came, she spent the entire morning cleaning, rearranging, second-guessing every detail of the house. It wasn't vanity, it was anxiety masquerading. As preparation, I offered to stay or to leave, whichever made her more comfortable, and after a long silence, she said she wanted me there. When the doorbell finally rang, she opened it with trembling hands. Her sister stood there, older than the last photo I'd seen, but still recognizable, with a hesitant smile and tired eyes. What happened next surprised me. There were no accusations, no rehearsed speeches, just an embrace, tight and wordless, that lasted longer than either of them probably expected. I stood back, letting them have their moment. They talked for hours in the living room, and while I stayed nearby, I didn't intrude. I heard snippets, memories, apologies, shared laughter that hadn't filled this house in years. When her sister finally left, my girl sat beside me, face streaked with quiet tears, but lighter somehow, like a door inside her had finally swung open. That night, she crawled into bed beside me and whispered, almost to herself, that she never thought she'd feel whole again. I pulled her close, not because I had the words to fix everything, but because sometimes being held is the only answer that makes sense. She fell asleep in my arms, the kind of sleep that only comes when a weight has been lifted. And I lay there, heart full, marveling at how far we'd come from that first desperate knock on the door. We didn't talk much about the future. We started living like there was one. We took small trips to a nearby lake, to a bookstore she loved as a girl, to places that held ghosts she was finally learning to make peace with. She began introducing me to old friends, and while some raised eyebrows at the age gap, most simply saw the way we looked at each other and let it be. One of her oldest friends pulled me aside once and said, "I haven't seen her like this in years. Thank you." And I didn't know how to respond. It didn't feel like I was doing anything extraordinary. I was just showing up, staying, choosing her every day. But the most significant moment came not with a grand gesture, but during an ordinary evening. We were having dinner, just the two of us. A simple meal she'd prepared with music playing. Softly in the background, she looked up from her plate and said, "Do you know what I realized today? I'm not afraid of being alone anymore, because I'm not hiding from myself, and I'm not hiding from you." That admission, quiet as it was, hit harder than any declaration of love, because it meant trust. It meant she had stopped waiting for the world to disappoint her. It meant she believed in us. After dinner, we danced in the living room. No choreography, no music loud enough to dictate steps, just the two of us, moving slowly, holding on like the moment could stretch forever, and maybe in a way it did, because in that small, warm house, in the flicker of candlelight, we weren't defined by how we met or by what had broken us before. We were just two people who had chosen to be gentle with each other in a world that rarely is. That night, as we lay in bed, she whispered that she didn't want this to end. I told her it didn't have to. We didn't need to know every step ahead to keep walking. We just needed to promise that we'd keep showing up, keep choosing softness, keep holding the door open even if one of us came to it crying again someday. And that, we both knew, was more than enough. There's a kind of peace that doesn't come all at once, but in fragments, in moments so small they could be missed if you're not paying attention. That's what the days started to feel like with her, like tiny waves gently softening the edges of a once rough shoreline. We weren't rushing anything, not trying to reach some milestone or title, but rather just letting time mold whatever this was into something steady and meaningful. There were no scripts, no expectations, just a people who had seen their fair share of ache now choosing kindness over caution. Mornings became my favorite part of the day. It's not because they were filled with grand romance or elaborate gestures, but because of how effortlessly we existed together. She'd brew coffee while humming some old tune she barely remembered the name of, and I'd sit at the counter pretending to read the paper while secretly just watching her move. Her presence filled the room like sunlight, quiet but undeniable. And sometimes, in those still moments, she'd catch me staring and smile without saying a word. And it felt like a conversation more intimate than anything language could offer. The little things mattered most. The way she would remember exactly how I liked my toast barely crisp, with a little too much butter. The way she could tell when I needed silence and when I needed her to talk, even if it was just about the weather or what color she was thinking of painting next. I did my part too, in these unspoken rituals of care. I fixed things before they needed fixing. I stocked the fridge with her favorite dark chocolate. I'd even sneak flowers into the garden, ones I knew she used to love as a child, so that when they bloomed, it would feel like magic rather than memory. 8. And she noticed. She always noticed. Still, for all the quiet beauty of our routine, there was something growing in the background, a gentle but persistent shift, like a tide turning. One afternoon, as we sat on the porch watching the sky change colors, she mentioned an art show in the next town over. She said it offhandedly at first, almost like she was talking to herself, but I knew what it meant. It wasn't just a show. It was a chance to step back into the world, to share the part of herself she'd hidden for years. She looked at me after she said it, waiting for something, permission, maybe, or reassurance. I gave her both without hesitation. I told her I thought the world could use a little more of what she had to give. And though she tried to brush off my words, I saw the way they softened her posture. Like a door unlocking from the inside. The week leading up to the show was a whirlwind. She was nervous, excited, uncertain. She kept second-guessing which pieces to include, worried that none of it was good enough. I reminded her that art wasn't about perfection. It was about honesty. Her work was nothing if not honest. On the day of the exhibit, I helped her load the van, careful with each frame, treating them like sacred objects. She wore a simple black dress, elegant and unassuming. And I could see the battle between fear and pride playing out in her eyes. But when we arrived and she saw her name printed on the flyer, something shifted. She straightened her shoulders. She smiled, not nervously, but with genuine warmth. It wasn't about recognition or praise. It was about claiming a part of herself she'd almost forgotten. The gallery was small, but intimate, filled with people who wandered from piece to piece, murmuring admiration, pausing thoughtfully in front of her work. I stood nearby, letting her have her moment, watching from a distance as she answered questions, laughed with strangers, and for the first time since I'd met her, stood completely in her element. She looked radiant, not just because of the setting or the attention, but because she was no longer shrinking. She was taking up space, and it suited her. Later that night, as we drove home, she rested her head against the window and said she hadn't felt that alive in years. I didn't respond. I just reached over and took her hand. And she laced her fingers through mine like it was the most natural thing in the world. But not every day could be filled with triumph, life as it tends to do. Through us, its curveballs. The call came from her. Doctor, about a routine test that needed follow-up. She didn't say much, just nodded along and hung up with a face that betrayed nothing. But I knew. I knew the way her fingers twitched nervously after. Knew the way her laughter was slightly delayed that evening. I asked her about it. She tried to brush it off, saying it was probably nothing. But fear isn't always rational. Sometimes it creeps in, even when the odds are in your favor. And so, we waited for days, then a week, for the results. Each of us pretending not to count the minutes. During that time, she withdrew slightly. Not from me exactly, but into herself. I gave her space, but not distance. I cooked her meals she barely touched. I sat beside her in silence, letting her know I was there, even when words felt heavy. When the call finally came, I watched her tense up again, phone pressed tightly to her ear. Then relief. It washed over her like a tide breaking. Everything was fine. The test was clear. She laughed then, a deep, full-bodied sound that filled the room. And when she looked at me, tears spilling down her cheeks. I pulled her into my arms and held her like I never wanted to let go. That night we lay in bed, the storm having passed, and she whispered that she'd been more afraid of losing us than anything else. That for the first time in her life, she had something to lose, and I told her I felt the same. Whatever this was, messy, uncertain, imperfect hit was the most real thing I'd ever known. And in that moment, we weren't two people divided by years or pasts or fears. We were simply human, raw, open, connected. The next morning, she painted again. But this time her canvas was brighter, bolder. The colors didn't hold back. And as I watched her from the doorway, brush in hand, hair pulled back, sunlight spilling across the floor, I realized something. Love doesn't always announce itself with grand gestures or poetic words. Sometimes it arrives quietly on the heels of a desperate plea. Sometimes it starts with a knock at the door and a voice trembling with loneliness. And sometimes, if you're lucky, it stays not because it has to, but because it chooses to. Every single daytime had settled into a comforting rhythm for both of us, a rhythm that didn't need announcing or definition. It was just there, like the soft hum of the house in the early morning when the world still felt half asleep. Or like the way her fingers would find mine without looking when we'd sit on the porch during twilight. She had grown into herself again, fuller, more whole, as if each passing week rebuilt a part of her that had crumbled quietly under years of silence and solitude. It wasn't a transformation that shouted, it was slow and deeply rooted, like ivy creeping gently along old stone, persistent but delicate. I had come to know her moods the way sailors know the sea, not by words, but by shifts in the air, glances, the rhythm of her steps, or the angle of her shoulders when she moved about the kitchen. And in the same way, she had come to read me, recognizing the slight tension in my jaw when something was on my mind. The way I stared too long at the same spot when I was somewhere else in my head, one chilly Saturday morning, the first real sign that summer had given way to fall. We took a drive, no destination. She liked it that way, said it made her feel free. So we rolled the windows down just a crack, let the wind mess with our hair, and followed the road as it curved through sleepy towns and open fields that wore golden hues like worn-out shawls. She brought a thermos of spiced tea and a playlist of songs that neither of us had heard in years. Between the music and the silence, we shared stories we hadn't yet told, about lost friends, childhood fears, regrets that still lingered in the quiet corners of our hearts. She told me about the first time she ever wanted to be loved, not in a movie way, not with fireworks or declarations, but gently, patiently, by someone who saw her even when she didn't want to be seen. I didn't say anything. I just looked at her because I already knew that was what I was doing now. Seeing her. Not just the strong parts or the graceful ones, but the scarred, tired, frightened pieces too. We stopped at an old roadside stand where an elderly couple sold homemade apple pies and worn books for $1 each. She picked out a novel with a faded cover and a recipe card tucked between the pages, handwritten in blue ink. She held it like it was treasure. I bought the pie and a small sunflower in a jar, which she cradled in her lap the rest of the way. Home. It was these kinds of moments that built the life we were creating, not grand milestones or plans, but ordinary fragments strung together like beads on a thread. And I think that's what she needed most. Not the thrill of newness, but the safety of consistency. Someone who showed up, someone who stayed. Later that week, I came back to the house with a surprise. She had mentioned once in passing that she missed having her own little space to work, not just for painting, but for writing, thinking, breathing. So I took the old shed in the backyard, the one that had been rotting with neglect, and turned it into something else. It wasn't much. Just a cleaned-out space with fresh paint, a small desk, a cozy chair, and shelves waiting to be filled. I hung string lights across the beams and left a note on the desk with a single word, yours. When she saw it, she stood there for a long time without speaking, her eyes tracing every corner of the space like she couldn't quite believe it was real. Then she turned to me and I saw something in her expression that I'll never forget. It wasn't just gratitude. It was the look of someone who had finally been chosen, not out of obligation, but out of love. That night we stayed out in the shed long after the lights in the house had dimmed. She lit a candle, pulled a blanket over both of us, and leaned into me with a contented sigh. The walls of that small space held our silence like it was sacred, and I realized then that this quiet, this closeness, this shared breath was what intimacy really looked like. It didn't have to shout. To be profound, it just had to be honest. As the season deepened, so did our connection. She invited me into more pieces of her world. She introduced me to the neighbors she once avoided, brought me to her favorite bookstore where the owner knew her name and reading tastes like an old friend. We started cooking together real meals, not just takeout or thrown together salads. She taught me how to knead dough with patience. I taught her how to grill the perfect steak. We burned a few things. We laughed a lot. And somewhere between the flour on our hands and the music in the background, we built something resembling a home. But just when things seemed almost too beautiful to be real, something happened that reminded us both how fragile joy can be. One evening, as we were locking up for the night, she found a letter in her mailbox. No return address. Inside was a simple card with 2 photos of her old ones. From decades ago when she was younger, before her world had fallen apart, along. With them was a note in blocky handwriting. I never forgot you. Her hands trembled slightly as she showed me. I asked who it was. She shook her head, lips pressed tight. Someone from a life I buried, she finally said. Elaborate. That didn't need to. The shadows in her eyes said enough. That night she was distant, not cold, just somewhere else. I didn't push, just stayed near. Eventually, she told me about Mark. Her first love. It's the man who said all the right things and meant none of them, the one who promised a future and delivered absence. He had vanished just like that, without goodbye or explanation, left her waiting for years for answers that never came. She had grieved him like a ghost, someone who wasn't dead, but no longer existed in her world. And now, this letter, its echo from the past. It rattled her in ways I couldn't fully understand. But I held her hand while she sorted through the emotions, and when she asked if I thought she should respond, I told her the truth, that whatever choice she made, I'd support it. Not because I wasn't afraid of losing her, but because love that tries to control isn't love at all. It's fear in disguise. She never wrote back. She burned the letter the next morning, standing barefoot in the garden with tears on her cheeks, and resolve in her spine. She said it was time to stop letting the past decide her present. And as the ashes floated up into the sky like black petals, she turned to me and smiled. Not the kind of smile you give to be polite, but one that says, I'm still here. I choose this. I choose you. And I chose her too. Over and over again. The days that followed seemed to flow like slow-moving water, gentle and steady, with an undercurrent of something neither of us dared say aloud yet. There was peace in the routine. We had unconsciously created a rhythm that didn't require planning or conversation, only presence. She had begun to paint again. And every morning I'd find her with a coffee in one hand and a brush in the other, look of quiet focus softening her features as she lost herself in color and canvas. I watched from the kitchen window, not wanting to interrupt her process because something about the way she moved, the way she dipped into her art, felt sacred. She wasn't just painting anymore. She was healing, building something vibrant in the places that used to be silent and gray. Her strokes were bold, deliberate, like each color she chose was a declaration of self after years of whispers. I felt a strange pride watching her, as if somehow, by showing up and staying, I had helped open a door within her that had long been locked. I kept working around the house, slowly tending to the small projects she once thought didn't matter. But they did. Every nail I hammered, every loose hinge I tightened, every broken tile I replaced, they were more than repairs.
Ow.
They were offerings. Not grand gestures, but proof that I saw her, that I cared enough to tend to the things she lived with every day. I didn't need a thank you each time. Her expression, the relaxed curve of her mouth, the way she sometimes reached for my hand without thinking, that was more than enough. And while we hadn't yet named what was growing between us, it was there, undeniable, like the warmth of sunlight through a window even on a cold day. One afternoon, as the light began to shift into the amber glow of late autumn, I caught her standing in the doorway of the studio I had built. She was holding one of her canvases, half finished, and staring at it with an unreadable expression. When I approached, she didn't speak at first. Instead, she leaned the painting against the wall and walked past me, heading for the back garden. I followed quietly, sensing something stirring in her. She stopped by the old tree near the fence line, the one she said had been there since she moved in, and placed her hand on its trunk like she was greeting an old friend. I stood behind her, giving her space, but not leaving. After a long moment, she said in a voice barely above a whisper that this had once been her hiding place. That when her world had been too loud or too empty, she'd come here as if the tree itself could understand. I listened, still and silent, as she confessed that this house had always felt too big for one person, too full of echoes and memories, that until recently it had felt like a museum of everything she had lost. She turned to me then, her eyes holding something fragile but strong. She said she didn't want to live like that anymore, not in a space defined by emptiness, not in a life dictated by fear. She wanted joy, real joy, not just the absence of sadness. And she wasn't sure how to ask for it, how to reach for it, but she wanted to try. I told her, without saying it out loud, that she wasn't alone anymore, that she didn't have to figure it all out on her own. That trying was enough. Because love, I was beginning to realize, wasn't always about knowing what to do. It was about being willing to stand beside someone. While they found their way, we spent that evening sitting on the back porch, sharing a blanket, as the wind danced through the trees and the stars blinked into view. She rested her head on my shoulder and we didn't say much. We didn't need to. Our silence had become its own kind of language, full of comfort and understanding. At one point, she reached up and touched the side of my face gently, tracing the curve of my cheek as if memorizing it. I closed my eyes, feeling the weight and warmth of that moment sink into me like something permanent. It wasn't a kiss, not yet, but it was a promise one made without words, in the language of gestures and glances and shared breath. The next morning brought a kind of clarity neither of us expected. She woke me early, pulling me by the hand, to the kitchen where the scent of cinnamon filled the air. She had baked something, a rare event, and stood beaming with pride as she presented it like a prize. The rolls were uneven, a little burnt at the edges, but to me they were perfect. She laughed when I took a bite and said they were the best thing I'd ever tasted. Her laughter had changed. It was fuller now, less careful. She laughed, like someone who wasn't afraid of being seen. It's like someone who believed, even if just for a little while, that she was worthy of lightness. Later that day, we drove into town to buy more paint. She wanted to repaint the front hallway, said it needed to feel more like her, not just the version of herself she had once pretended to be for everyone else. We argued playfully over colors. She leaned toward warm golds and soft sage, I suggested. A pale blue, she immediately dismissed. We compromised on a dusky rose, she said, reminded her of old postcards. It was a small thing, but it felt huge, because she wasn't just changing the house, she was reclaiming it. She was making it her own again, not a monument to loneliness, but a living, breathing space filled with choices and chances and second beginnings. That night, while she painted, the hallway with flecks of color streaking her arms, I sat nearby and read from the novel she had left on the counter.
Ow.
She had written small notes in the margins, observations, questions, the occasional sarcastic comment, and they made me smile. They were windows into her mind, her sense of humor, her way of processing the world. I loved those scribbles. They were raw and unfiltered and honest, and in them I saw the heart of the woman I had grown to care for so deeply, not just the surface of her, but the parts hidden beneath layers of time and fear and heartbreak. Eventually, the paintbrush slipped from her fingers and she sat down beside me, both of us quiet as we looked at the newly painted wall. Not perfect, she said softly, almost apologetically. I turned to her and replied with the calm certainty I rarely used, neither are we, but we're getting better. She smiled then, the kind of smile that made my chest ache a little, because it was filled with so much hope, so much vulnerability. And I realized in that moment that this slow, imperfect, beautiful unfolding was exactly what I wanted. Not just with her, but for her. A life rebuilt, not in a rush, but with care, with presence, with both hands steady and willing. She leaned her head against my shoulder again. I wrapped my arm around her, anchoring us both in that moment. Outside, the wind rustled the trees, and somewhere in the distance a dog barked. But inside, in that small pocket of the world we had created together, everything was still and full and exactly as it should be. There was something delicate about the days that came after, as though time itself had softened its edges to make room for this quiet rebirth neither of us had fully planned for. The house, which had once seemed like a solemn structure meant to contain years of silence and stillness, now breathed with warmth and motion. It was in the simple things, the slightly askew picture frames we'd laughed over and left crooked on purpose, the fresh coats of paint catching the late afternoon sun, the scent of her tea steeping in the kitchen, and the way our footsteps began to echo together instead of apart. She had begun placing small vases of flowers in corners I would have never noticed. Some wild, some from the market, always fresh, always vibrant, always intentionally arranged as if she were filling the home not only with color but with quiet joy. She still painted, though, less in solitude now. I would catch her glancing over her shoulder, checking to see if I was watching, and I always was. Not just out of admiration for her art, but because every movement she made, every tilt of her head or flick of her brush, had become a small celebration of the version of herself she had once hidden and now proudly revealed. I didn't need to be her muse. I only needed to be there, near, steady, constant. I had been fixing the front door latch that afternoon when I heard her calling my name. It wasn't urgent, but there was something in the tone that made me set my tools down and wipe my hands hastily on my jeans before stepping inside. She was standing in the middle of the living room, surrounded by papers and boxes, her hair pulled back loosely, her sleeves rolled up, her expression unreadable. She had finally started going through the storage boxes in the attic, the ones she had always said she wasn't ready to open. I'd offered to help, not with pressure, just in case she wanted company. Today, she did. As I stepped closer, I saw the contents-sold photographs, yellowed letters, trinkets, dusty keepsakes, and memories that had been too painful to face before now. She handed me a picture without a word. God, it was her, much younger, standing next to a man I assumed had once meant the world to her. Her smile in that photo was wide, fearless, and bright. She watched me quietly as I studied it, then told me that she had lost him years ago, not to tragedy, but to life pulling in opposite directions. She said he hadn't been cruel, just absent when she needed him most, and eventually, absence became the only language they shared. She sat down and began sorting through the papers, and I sat beside her, letting her talk when she wanted, holding space when she didn't. She found a letter she had written to herself but never opened. The envelope was sealed, the handwriting hesitant. She looked at it for a long time before handing it to me and asking me to read it aloud. I hesitated, unsure if it was my place, but she nodded once, trusting me. Written in a moment of deep loneliness and doubt, it spoke of fear, of feeling invisible, wondering if she had already lived the best parts of her life and missed the chance to be truly seen. It wasn't poetic. It was honest, cracked open, and trembling. When I finished, there were tears in her eyes, but she wasn't ashamed. She said she had forgotten what it felt like to write those words, to even admit those feelings to herself. But now, hearing them again in my voice, she realized something had shifted. She no longer felt like that woman. She had outgrown the grief. We sat on the floor until the sun dipped below the windows, and I realized how much of a gift it was to witness someone reassemble themselves, not all at once, but piece by piece. Later that evening, we lit candles instead of using the overhead lights. She said she preferred the way the flickering glow softened the walls, made everything feel more intimate, more alive. We ate dinner on the floor of the living room, surrounded by her memories and mine now too. She told me stories about the people in the photos, about her childhood, her parents, her old dog, the friend who taught her to paint, the neighbor who used to bring her fresh peaches every summer. And I listened. Not because I felt obligated, but because each story was another thread connecting her to the woman she had become. There was a quiet wonder in seeing her unearth her own past and find strength in it instead of sadness. That night, as we cleaned up the scattered boxes, I found one tucked behind a bookshelf labeled simply, "For later." She hadn't remembered. Packing it, side were journals, some half-filled, others barely touched. She flipped through them quickly at first, then more slowly, stopping occasionally to read passages aloud. Her voice trembled sometimes, but more often than not. She laughed at her own melodrama, at her attempts to sound wise, at the things she thought she'd never overcome. She handed me one of the journals, said she wanted me to have it. I protested, but she insisted. It wasn't a goodbye or a gesture of detachment, it was a sign of trust. She told me I had helped her become someone who no longer needed to hide those parts of herself in boxes labeled later. Before we turned in for the night, she stood in the hallway staring at her reflection in the mirror, a simple square thing hanging just beside the linen closet. I caught her adjusting her hair, smoothing down her shirt. There was something tender in her movements, not vanity, but care. She caught my gaze in the reflection and smiled almost shyly. I told her. She looked at peace, and she said she felt it too, for the first time in a very long time. We didn't kiss, not yet, but the space between us was full of unspoken understanding. And when she turned out the light, she took my hand in hers and held it all the way to sleep. The following morning came with a quiet stillness, the kind that settled softly in the bones and told you something had changed, even if you couldn't quite say what. I woke up before the sun did, lying on the couch beneath a throw blanket she had draped over me the night before. I could smell the faint hint of her perfume lingering in the air. Something floral and old-fashioned, like jasmine folded into linen. The living room looked different in the early light warmer somehow, as if the house had decided to hold on to the comfort of the previous night. I sat there for a moment, watching the way the dawn painted gentle amber strokes across the walls. And I thought of her, just down the hallway, wrapped in sleep. There was something deeply humbling about knowing she had let me into a space she'd once kept so carefully guarded. Not just the physical home, but the private places of her heart where she had once hidden away her pain, her hopes, her memories. And now those places had names and shapes and colors. And I was a part of them. I quietly made my way to the kitchen, trying not to make the floorboards creak beneath my steps. I didn't want to wake her just yet. She had looked so peaceful the night before, and I wanted her to have that peace for a little longer. I set about making coffee, though I wasn't sure where everything was yet. I found the filters after checking 3 cupboards, and the mugs after nearly knocking over a row of carefully stacked bowls. Still, it was worth it. The smell of fresh coffee filled the space like a soft exhale. I poured a cup and stepped outside to the porch, letting the cool morning air wrap around me. There was something sacred about those early hours, the way the world stretched and yawned. Not quite awake, not quite asleep, caught in that liminal place where thoughts moved slower and everything felt more honest. I sat on the steps, mug warm between my hands, and listened to the wind rustling through the trees. For the first time in a long time, I didn't feel like I was waiting for anything. I wasn't chasing a job or a paycheck or even a purpose. I was just there, and it was enough. Eventually, I heard the gentle sound of the door opening behind me. She appeared hair-tousled from sleep, wrapped in an oversized sweater that hung loosely around her frame. Her eyes found mine, and she gave me a sleepy smile that made my chest tighten in the best way. She sat beside me without saying anything, and I handed her the second cup of coffee I'd poured just in case. She took it with a quiet thank you and leaned her shoulder against mine. We watched the sun rise together like that, not speaking, just breathing in sync. After a while, she turned to me and asked what I was thinking. I told her the truth, that I was thinking about how peaceful this moment was, how rare it felt to just sit with someone and not need to fill the silence. She nodded, her eyes soft and far away. She said that for years her mornings had been filled with noise, the noise of her thoughts, of loneliness, of pretending to be okay when she wasn't. And now, with me beside her, the silence felt safe, instead of suffocating. Later that day, she asked if I'd go into town with her. There was a small bookstore she used to love, the kind with creaky floors and handwritten signs, and she hadn't been there in years. I agreed, without hesitation. Riding in her car was a strange mix of nostalgia and novelty, she hummed along. Two old songs on the radio pointed out landmarks from her younger days, and told stories that spilled out of her like water breaking through a long-blocked dam. At the bookstore, she moved like a woman rediscovering joy in the little things. Her fingers traced the spines of novels she hadn't read since her 20s, and she picked up a few books just because the covers made her smile. I watched her from the corner of the room, and in that moment, she looked like a woman unburdened. Longer defined by the weight of being alone, but by the lightness of being seen. On the drive back, she reached over and held my hand, her thumb brushing over my knuckles like it was the most natural thing in the world. She said it was strange how quickly things could change, not the kind of change that comes with upheaval, but the slow, gentle kind that creeps in through acts of kindness and trust. She said she didn't feel alone anymore. Not because someone had swooped in and saved her, but because she had let herself be found. That night, back at the house, she lit a fire in the fireplace, and we sat on the rug with books we hadn't yet opened and stories we hadn't yet told. I don't remember falling asleep. I only remember the warmth, her laughter, and the way her fingers curled into mine as if to say, "I'm here now, and I'm not going anywhere." The days that followed felt like pages in a book I never wanted to end, each one unfolding with a quiet rhythm that was both new and familiar. There was something about the way she moved through her space now that struck me. The way her hands no longer trembled when reaching for a coffee mug. The way her voice carried a steady warmth when she spoke to me, or to herself, or to the plants. On her windowsill, the air in her home felt different too, as if the walls had been waiting for laughter to return. There was music again, not blaring. It's just soft jazz or old vinyl records that had gathered dust until she brought them out one morning with a bashful smile. We spent that day sorting through them, sitting on the floor surrounded by sleeves and memories, her stories pouring out with each album we played. She had a way of speaking that made everything feel cinematic. Like even the quiet heartbreaks of her youth were threaded with beauty and resilience. And though I'd known her only a short while, it was becoming harder to remember a time when I hadn't. In the afternoons, we started walking her neighborhood. It wasn't much a few winding streets, older homes with peeling paint and gardens, in various stages of care, but to her, it was the world. She showed me which houses used to have kids running around, which neighbor once brought her cookies at Christmas, which yard had a tree that used to bloom pink and then stopped after a harsh winter. It was these little details that revealed the depth of her solitude. She hadn't just been alone in her home, she had been alone in her history, her memories floating in a quiet vacuum. But now, she wasn't recounting those things to herself. Anymore, she was sharing them with me, anchoring them in the present by letting someone witness them. And with every story, every pause to watch a squirrel dart across the path or a wind chime stir in the breeze, I could feel something growing between us that neither of us dared name just yet. One evening, she invited me to the backyard. I hadn't seen much of it, only glimpses through the kitchen window. But stepping out there was like stepping into another version of her. The garden had been neglected, sure, but I could see what it once had been. Twisting vines that had outgrown there. Trellises, flower beds half choked by weeds but still blooming in stubborn patches. She walked barefoot on the stone path, tugging me along, laughing at how overgrown everything had gotten. Then she pointed to a wooden bench at the edge of the yard. It was faded and slightly crooked, but she sat anyway, patting the space beside her. I joined her, and we sat in silence for a while, watching the sky melt into the kind of twilight that seems to stretch forever. She told me she used to sit out there every night when her husband was still around before things between them turned from cold to invisible. I didn't ask for more, I just listened. And when her hand found mine again, I didn't let go. There was a weight to the way she leaned on me that evening, not physical, but emotional. Like she was finally allowing herself to be held up by someone else. She wasn't fragile. Far from it, but she had been carrying so much for so long that I could almost feel the relief in her breath. As she exhaled into the stillness beside me, the wind picked up slightly, brushing loose strands of hair across her face, and without thinking I reached over and tucked them behind her ear. She didn't flinch or pull away. Instead, she leaned closer, resting her head against my shoulder, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. In that moment, I realized how easy it had become to care for her, not out of pity, not because she needed saving, but because in her quiet strength and gentle vulnerability, she had revealed something deeply human and achingly real. Later inside, she made tea while I cleaned up the dishes from dinner. It was a domestic rhythm we'd slipped into without planning, without even talking about it. She handed me a mug with a smile, and we settled on the couch, the television flickering low in the background. She wasn't wearing makeup, and there were tiny laugh lines around her eyes that she once seemed so self-conscious about. But to me, they were perfect, like map lines that told the story of a life fully lived, scars and all. She asked if I was happy, if being here with her was something I looked forward to, or just something I tolerated. I didn't hesitate. I told her that in all the noise and rush of the life I had before this, I never felt as grounded as I did here, sitting beside her, doing nothing and everything all at once. She didn't say anything back, but her eyes grew soft and glassy, and she looked away like she needed a second to steady herself. I didn't push. I just let the moment breathe. And somewhere between that silence and the warmth of her presence beside me, I realized that something had changed. Again, subtly, but unmistakably. This wasn't just a story about helping someone through their loneliness. It had become something else, something neither of us had expected, but neither of us was afraid of anymore. The next morning brought a kind of stillness that didn't feel empty, but full. I woke up early, like I usually did, but instead of rushing to leave or filling the quiet with tasks, I lingered. I sat on the edge of the guest bed she'd prepared for me weeks ago, looking around at the room that had somehow become more than a temporary place to sleep. There were small signs of permanence now: my phone charger plugged into the wall, a folded hoodie tossed over the chair, a pair of socks tucked under the dresser. It wasn't my home, not officially, but it didn't feel like I was just passing through either, and that unsettled me in the best possible way. I went downstairs and found her already up, sitting at the kitchen table with a steaming mug between her palms. She didn't say anything at first, just looked up and smiled with eyes that still carried sleep. That smile, tired and soft, hit me harder than I expected. There was no makeup, no effort to perform anything, just her as she was, and I couldn't help but feel grateful she let me see her like that. I poured myself a cup of coffee and joined her, both of us, wrapped in the quiet kind of comfort that doesn't require words. We sat like that for a long time, listening to the creak of the old fridge and the distant hum of a lawnmower down the street. Eventually, she spoke, her voice just above a whisper, asking me what my plans were for the day. It was a simple question, but I could feel the subtext underneath. Was I staying? Was this just a pause in my life? Or was I weaving it into hers more permanently? I told her I had a few small tech jobs later in the week, but today I was free. Her shoulders relaxed, only slightly, but enough for me to notice. She stood and moved toward the back door, motioning for me to follow her outside. The garden was brighter that morning, touched by early sun and scattered petals. She pointed to a patch near the fence that she had once dreamed of turning into a vegetable bed. Her husband never helped, and over the years the idea had wilted just like everything else. She shrugged as if to say it was silly to still care about it, but I saw the hope glimmering just beneath her dismissal. So I offered to help. She laughed a little, like she didn't believe me, but I told her I was serious. And that's how we ended up spending the next few hours pulling weeds, turning soil, and dragging bags of compost from the garage. She got dirt under her nails and smudged her cheek, and I teased her about it, which made her laugh more freely than I'd ever heard. There was something intoxicating about her like that, and guarded, focused, alive. We broke for lunch, sweaty and tired, but there was a lightness in her step that hadn't been there before. She put on a record something upbeat and retro and danced her way into the kitchen while throwing together sandwiches. I watched from the couch, letting myself fall deeper into this strange, beautiful rhythm we'd created together. We weren't just healing her loneliness anymore. We were building something. And though we hadn't defined it yet, hadn't spoken its name, it was real in a way that few things in my life had been. After lunch, she sat beside me, and we talked about things that didn't hurt: favorite movies, embarrassing childhood moments, bad haircuts, and near disasters with cooking. It felt normal, domestic, like a Sunday you'd look forward to all week. And the more we talked, the more I noticed how often her eyes searched mine for reaction, connection, reassurance that this wasn't just some fluke, that I wasn't just being kind because I pitied her. As the sun dipped lower, we returned to the garden. She planted the first seedling herself, her hands shaking just a little, and looked up at me like she needed me to witness it. I knelt beside her, pressing my hand into the soil beside hers, grounding both of us in something that felt like a promise. The breeze shifted, and she closed her eyes for a moment, letting it pass through her like a blessing. I watched her, memorizing the curve of her jaw, the soft lines at the corners of her eyes, the way she bit her bottom lip when she was trying not to cry. She opened her eyes and met mine, and in that silence, something passed between us that didn't need to be explained. It wasn't just about love or attraction. It was about being seen. Finally, completely seen. That night, we sat on the porch with glasses of wine. Wrapped in an old blanket, she said, belonged to her mother. The stars were out, and the air was thick with the smell of earth and flowers and new beginnings. She leaned against me, her head tucked beneath my chin, and whispered that she couldn't believe how different everything felt. I told her I could. I told her this wasn't a miracle or magic. This was what happened when someone opened the door, not just the front door, but all the locked ones behind it, and let another person in. She grew quiet after that, and I let her have the silence, knowing that sometimes the heart speaks loudest when the mouth doesn't move. In the distance, a dog barked, a sprinkler hissed to life, and the world continued spinning. But right there, in that little pocket of stillness on her porch, time slowed down just enough for us to breathe. The next few days moved like a quiet tide, steady and full of a kind of calm I hadn't realized I'd been craving all my life. Mornings began not with urgency, but with the gentle sound of her humming somewhere in the house, the smell of coffee drifting from the kitchen, and the warmth of sunlight pouring through the sheer curtains she had never bothered to replace. Find her barefoot on the porch or crouched beside the garden, already deep in some quiet project. A little dirt on her knees and a soft smile on her face when she spotted me. There was no need for grand plans or elaborate conversations anymore. We had passed the point of trying to impress or explain. It was only this shared rhythm, this comforting ease of two people who had peeled back their layers and found something steady underneath. Our hands moved in sync, whether we were weeding the garden or folding the laundry. And there were long stretches of silence that spoke louder than any words. In the afternoons, she'd pull out a stack of books she'd been meaning to read, and I'd sit with her on the porch, sometimes reading along, other times just watching the way her lips moved as she followed the words. It struck me often how easy she was to be around. For someone who had once opened the door in tears, claiming she was completely alone, she now seemed to glow with a quiet strength that made me feel more anchored than I ever had before. She wasn't trying to fill space anymore. She was simply present, and that presence became the center of everything for me. The neighbors had started to wave more often, sometimes pausing to chat. There was no longer that look of pity in their eyes when they glanced at her house. Now there was something closer to curiosity, maybe even admiration, and she noticed it too. It's not that she cared much for what people thought, but I could tell it felt good to be seen differently, to be seen as someone who was living, not just surviving. One evening, as the sun slipped below the trees, casting long golden shadows across the grass, she pulled out an old photo album. We sat cross-legged on the living room floor. She flipped through the pages slowly, telling me stories about her childhood, her awkward teenage years, and the early days of her marriage. Her fingers lingered on some photos longer than others, and there were moments when her voice cracked, but she never stopped turning the pages. She showed me a picture of herself at 22, standing beside her first car, grinning with windblown hair. I stared at that image for a long time, trying to connect it to the woman beside me. And what I saw wasn't the difference in years or features, it was the same fire in her eyes, softened by time but still burning. She noticed my expression and nudged me playfully, teasing that I must be seeing how wild she once was. I didn't argue. I told her I still saw it in her every day. Later that night, after she'd gone up to bed, I stayed downstairs for a while, staring out the window at the quiet street. Something inside me had shifted completely. I had arrived at her door weeks ago expecting to fix a machine, maybe offer a little support to someone who seemed broken by grief and time. But instead, I had found a woman who was rebuilding herself piece by piece, not needing anyone to save her, only someone to witness her return to life. And in witnessing her, I had been changed too. I wasn't just a helper anymore, or a guest. I was part of something, part of her days, her routines, her laughter. I knew she still had doubts, fears that crept in at night or clung to old wounds, but those didn't define her. They just made her real. And I had never wanted anything more real in my life. The next morning, she surprised me with a list. A to-do list, but a dream list. Things she wanted to try, places she wanted to see, skills she wanted to learn. It was scribbled on the back of a grocery receipt, full of little stars and side notes. She blushed when she handed it to me, saying she wasn't sure why she'd written it all down. I read it twice before speaking. Everything on that list was small, simple dreams, like learning to bake sourdough from scratch or visiting a sunflower farm, but each one pulsed with quiet longing. I looked up and told her I wanted to help her cross off every single one. She laughed, almost tearfully, and said maybe we'd start with the sunflowers. That weekend we packed a picnic and drove. Out to a farm 2 towns over, her window down, wind in her hair. And a kind of giddy energy in the way she tapped the dashboard along with the music. When we arrived, she stood in the middle of the field, arms outstretched, head tilted back, spinning slowly like a kid pretending to fly. Watched her from a few steps away, feeling the gravity of that moment settle in my chest. This was no longer about helping someone feel less alone. This was about being with someone I didn't want to live without. Summer began to fold into early fall, the air shifting subtly, carrying with it a cooler bite in the mornings, and a hush across the neighborhood that signaled change. The leaves had just begun their slow fade to gold, and every time we stepped outside, it felt like we were walking through a quiet promise that nothing stays the same. Maybe that was okay. She had taken to sitting on the back porch in the late afternoons, her sketchpad balanced on her knees, even though she always claimed she wasn't any good at drawing. I'd sit beside her, sometimes reading, sometimes just watching her brow furrow as she traced out trees or imagined shapes. She never let me see the finished pages, but that didn't matter. The act of it, the way she lost herself in those quiet minutes, was enough to say she was no longer just surviving. She was imagining again. One evening, she asked me if I remembered. The first day we met Hal, she opened the door with tears in her eyes and no idea who I was. I said I remembered everything. She smiled in that way she did when she didn't fully believe me but wanted to. She asked what I thought had changed. Since that day, I wanted to tell her everything had changed, but I also knew the real answer. She had. Not because I showed up, not because I fixed her computer or trimmed her lawn or stayed longer than I should have. She changed because she finally let herself want more. More than grief, more than quiet safety. She let herself be seen. And in doing that, she reminded me how to feel again. I told her that. And for the first time in a long time, she didn't cry when the words got too close to her heart. She just reached for my hand and held it like it belonged there. We never labeled what we had. It didn't seem to need a name. Just existed together in this gentle orbit, waking up in the same house. Trading quiet chores and slow mornings, sharing stories that spilled out without planning. She let herself rest. She laughed more. The lines around her eyes softened, not because time rewound, but because the weight she had carried for so long had finally loosened its grip. I noticed the way she lingered longer in front of mirrors now. Not with vanity, but with a kind of gratitude. She had come back to herself, and the reflection looking back no longer felt like a stranger. The neighborhood took notice too. There was a softness in how people greeted her now, a quiet admiration for how she had reclaimed her life. The mailman began stopping to chat. The couple down the street invited us to dinner. It was as though the world had been waiting for her to step back into the light. One afternoon, she found an old box of letters in her attic, notes from friends. Bits of poetry, even some she'd written to herself but never sent. We spent hours reading through them, and at one point, she paused and read a line aloud that stayed with me. "I think we are meant to grow wild again after pain, to become soft in our own skin, to live louder in the quiet." And me, and I could tell she hadn't realized she'd written it until just then. But I'd never heard anything describe her better. Eventually, we stopped keeping track of how long I'd been staying there. My tools were still in the shed, but now they lived next to a pair of worn gardening gloves that belonged to her. We had found a rhythm that didn't feel borrowed anymore. It felt permanent. Every now and then, she'd catch me staring at her while she read or cooked or painted, and she'd raise an eyebrow like she was daring me to explain myself. I always had the same answer. "Because you're here. Because I still remember the sound of your voice when you said, 'Help me.'" And I didn't know then that it would change both of us forever. On the first chilly night of October, she lit a fire in the old fireplace for the first time in years. We sat on the floor in front of it, wrapped in an oversized blanket, not saying much, just letting the crackling warmth settle around us. At one point, she leaned her head on my shoulder and whispered that she wasn't scared of being alone anymore, that even if I hadn't stayed, something inside her had shifted and wouldn't go back. I believed her. But I also told her she wasn't alone anymore, because I had filled a space, but because she had finally opened the door to herself. There wasn't a perfect bow at the end of our story, no grand declarations or sudden epiphanies, just the quiet unfolding of two lives, choosing each other day after day. She still had her hard days, and so did I, but we faced them together. And every time I heard her laugh or saw her eyes flicker with that old mischief, I knew the real truth. Some doors don't open for just anyone, but when they do, you walk through them and never look back. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.